Welcome to the UGC lecture series. This is the E-PG Pathshala lecture series on computer science, and we are talking about the paper machine learning. In this module we are going, and the next module we are going to discuss a very important concept, especially in today's world of big data and large amounts of data, dimensionality reduction. So, in this module we will be talking about dimensionality reduction, certain techniques here, one technique, what is dimensionality reduction, and one technique here, and in the next module we will be talking about two other techniques. There are more techniques, we are just taking a sample three techniques. These are the people responsible for the development of this particular module, and now we will look at the learning objectives. So, the learning objectives of this module are to explain the curse of dimensionality. We will explain what this means, because as the dimension increases, it means that the number of features considered has increased, and you expect the learning to be better, but it is not so. That is why it is called the curse of dimensionality. And we discuss what is the concept behind dimensionality reduction, and then we look at the two methods of dimensionality reduction, the concepts of feature selection and feature reduction. And then we look at in detail about one technique in this module, that is called principal component analysis, a method of dimensionality reduction. So, the keywords associated with this module are curse of dimensionality, dimensionality reduction, and two important mathematical concepts called variance and correlation. So, with this let us start with the module. So, first let us talk about the curse of dimensionality. Okay. So, what does this mean? From a theoretical viewpoint or from an intuitive viewpoint, you will normally think when you increase the number of features, you should get better performance. Okay. So, when you know more about something, you are likely to learn more about it. That is the intuitive method by which human beings do a lot of things, and so that is the same thing you expect machine learning systems to do. But however, in practice, the inclusion of more features leads to worse performance. Okay. That is because, that means if you have more features, it does not necessarily mean that your performance has increased, in fact it decreases, and this is what is called as the curse of dimensionality. And so, why is this so? Because as the dimensionality increases, the number of samples or training samples you need, examples you need needs to exponentially increase in order to exploit this dimensionality increase, and this does not normally happen. That is the reason why this performance is reduced. So, and obviously as you have more number of features and the dimensionality increases, the time complexity of the system also increases. So, as the dimension increases, time complexity increases. That is the normal problem. Okay. Now, a lot of methods have at least of the order of n d squared complexity, where n is the number of samples and d is the dimensionality of the problem or the number of features. For example, if we need to estimate the covariance matrix, what we are trying to say is as d increase, it is not that if you have d dimensions you need only d of the order of d, you need of the order of d squared. So, for example, if you have to estimate the covariance matrix, you need a 2 by 2 structure. So, you need d squared. So, as d becomes large, order of n d squared becomes too costly to do. So, this is one problem. So, if the number of features d is large, the number of samples n may be too small for accurate parameter estimation. So, here what we are trying to say is, we are trying to say two things. One is as d increases, as d is there, d squared is the minimum complexity that is there, of the order of complexity. So, as d increases, d squared increases also, and so that is costly. The other aspect is, this is a new aspect, as d increases, the number of samples n which you used for a smaller d is not sufficient any longer. It may become too small to actually do a proper computation. So, two aspects the complexity increases. One is because of the d squared increasing increasing exponentially, and also because n, the number of samples required, also is needs to increase in order to exploit this dimensionality. So, for example, the covariance matrix has d squared parameters, so approximately d squared parameters are needed. Now, for accurate estimation, n should be, now we are talking about the number of samples you needed. Okay. So, the n should be much bigger than d squared. Okay. So, if d the dimension is 2, you need n to be much bigger than 4. If it is n is 3, I mean d is 3, you need n to be much greater than 9 and so on. So, otherwise the model is too complicated for the data and it becomes overfitting. There is a problem of overfitting. We will come to this again. If d is less than, I mean n is less than d squared, we are better off assuming that features are uncorrelated even if we know that the assumption is wrong. So, if you have less number of samples compared to the d squared, where d is the dimension, then it is better off assuming that the features are not correlated at all, though our whole machine learning is based on the fact that the features are correlated. So, the assumption is wrong, but then it is better off doing that. That is a paradox we have. So, we are likely to avoid overfitting because we fit a model with less parameters. So, if you have less number of features, it is better to fit a model there because you will avoid overfitting. So, the problem of overfitting also comes into the picture. So, for example, here you have a example with the green shows a model with more parameters. You can see the number of samples that you have, and model with less parameters is the red line, and actually the red line is better because it is not overfitting, though the green line has a model with more parameters which you expect to do better, but look at it, you have less number of samples. So, the red line is better, that is what we are trying to say here. So, now let us look at the other problem. Suppose we want to use a nearest neighbor approach, okay, and k is equal to 1. So, 1 nearest neighbor. Then suppose we start with only one feature, and let us assume that this feature is not discriminative. What is the meaning of it is not discriminative? This feature does not separate the classes well. Remember, we are talking about classification basically. So, what we are trying to say is you have some features. For example, you want to see talk about the type of leaves that you have, and you say that the feature that you have is green, then it does not distinguish between the type of leaves. Okay. So, suppose shape is a discriminative feature, but color is not. So, suppose we start with one feature and this feature is not discriminative, that is it does not separate the classes well. Then you have this example, it is a one dimension, you have all the dimension, it is not separated at all. You can see that the green and the red are intermixed. This is a feature that does not discriminate well. Okay. Now, so we decide to use two features. So, for the KNN method where k is equal to 1 to work well, we need a lot of samples. That means the samples have to be dense. Remember, we are going from one dimension to a two dimension. So, to maintain the same intensity as in 1D, for example, here in this example we have 9 samples. So, if you want to maintain the same density in the two dimensional examples, how many samples do we need? That is the next question that we have to answer. So, we need 9 squared samples to maintain the same density. So, you can see how it increases from 9 samples in one dimensional, we are talking about 81 samples in two dimensional. So, for example, but you have only 9 samples. Okay. Of course, when we go from the feature 1 to number of features from 1 to 2, no one gives us more samples. What we have is the same 9 sample. So, we need actually, when we go from 1 to 2 features, what we are trying to say is we need 9 squared samples to maintain the same density as in the one dimensional case. In the one dimensional we had 9, here we need 9 squared or 81 samples. As you can see here in the left side diagram, you have 81 samples you need. But when we go from feature 1 to feature 2, no one is trying to give us more samples. So, if you have the same samples, you can see this. So, but this is too sparse, the right hand side where you have two dimensional, but the number of samples is the same 9, you find that the density is too sparse for the nearest neighbor to work well. Okay. Now, let us see the case when we use 3 features, it goes from bad to worse. So, if 9 was dense enough in 1D, in 3D we need 9 cubed, which is 729 samples. So, in general, if n samples is dense enough in 1D, then in d dimensions we need n to the power of d samples. Okay. So, this is what we are trying to say. So, in 3 dimension it look like this. What can you do with this in 1 KNN? So, it does not help you because it is too sparse. So, you get what I am saying. So, in 1 dimensional you have 9 features. When you go to 2 dimensional you need at least 81 features, that is n is equal to d, you need the density, number of samples to be n to the power of d. So, n squared if it is 2 features, n cubed if it is 3 features. And if you are left with only, no one is going to increase the number of samples because you have increased the number of features. So, otherwise it will be too sparse to be useful. We consider the case of 1n. So, now we go to the dimensionality reduction problem. Up to this point, we had spoken about the curse of dimensionality. So, there were two curses. One was that the time complexity or the complexity increases, it is of the order of n d squared, and as d increases, d squared increases. So, that is the complexity. But the other problem was, as d increases, the number of samples required also increases, and for it to be dense enough, as dense as it is in the one dimension lower dimension, you need it to be n to the power of d. So, both cases the complexity increases, and that is why it is called curse of dimensionality. It does not solve your problem. Okay. So, it is sparse enough with the same number of samples, increasing the dimension does not give you too much of information. So, now we go to the dimensionality reduction. What is dimensionality reduction generally? You project the high dimensional points that you have. So, you have three features. You project the points that you have in high dimension in a low dimensional space while preserving the essence of that data. This is called as dimensionality reduction in a conceptual manner. So, distances are preserved as well as possible when you project from high dimensional to a lower dimensional. So, this is an example. So, you have the 2 dimensional, it has been projected to 1 dimension. So, whatever distances were there between them has been maintained. So, this is what is called as the projection. This is just an example, small example. So, and then what you do, you project it into the lower dimensional by maintaining that essence, and then you solve the problem in low dimension. So, that is what you are trying to do. So, for a fixed number of samples, as we add features, there is a graph of classification error. What we are going to try to tell here is that it is not necessary to arbitrarily increase the features, because it has been proved that there is a graph of classification error, and up to a certain point the classification improves, but after that the error increases. So, let us look at that. So, this is the classification error and the number of features. As you can see, as the number of features increases, the error decreases up to a point. After that it starts increasing. So, the optimal number of features, there is an optimal number of features for a certain set of data when you want to do classification. Therefore, there is no point in unnecessarily increasing the dimension. So, thus for a fixed sample size n, for a sample size n, there is the optimal number of features that we should use. So, there is one how to find out this. So, we need not go beyond that optimal number of features. So, now we go to why dimensionality reduction. So, dimensionality reduction is in order to use the features, but at the same time to overcome the curse of dimensionality. So, if you reduce the dimension, what happens? It reduces time complexity because it is less computation and you have efficient retrieval. Also, space complexity is reduced because you have less number of parameters, and so therefore less storage is necessary. Simpler models are more robust on small data sets. If you have only small data sets, it is better to have a smaller model, that is less dimensional model. And then data visualization. So, if you want to visualize the data, you can do it only in 2 or 3 dimensions. So, if you want to visualize outliers, if you want to visualize structures, if you want to visualize groups, if you want to plot it, it has to be done in either 2 or 3 dimensions. No point having more than that dimensions. You cannot use it directly for data visualization. So, data visualization, one of the most important work in data visualization is this dimensionality reduction, where you lower the dimension from a large number of features to 2 or 3 so that you can visualize it. And visualization is a major area today because machine learning is used in a large number of applications where the person wants to visualize the correlations. So, for that type of application, this is very, very important, especially in today's world. And next you have, most machine learning and data mining techniques may not be effective for high dimensional data. Basically, we look at a lower dimensional data. Therefore, the intrinsic dimension, sometimes the intrinsic dimension of that data set itself may be small. For example, the number of genes that is responsible for a disease may be small. So, just increasing the dimension there will not give you a better answer, because there is a specific number of genes that is responsible for this. There is no point in increasing the number of dimensions. So, this is the reason why we go for dimensionality reduction. So, even though you have higher dimension, you can project it to a lower dimension and use all your machine learning techniques. Your data visualization can be done with that lower dimension. But of course, when you reduce from a higher dimension to a lower dimension, we have to necessarily keep the essence of the data, so that the distances that was there in the higher dimension is preserved in the lower dimension. So, now what is dimensionality reduction? It is the process of reducing the number of random variables that you are going to consider. Okay. So, there are two methods in which this is done. One is combine and transform or select features. There are two methods. We will go into a little more detail about this. So, the dimension reduced data can be used for visualizing, exploring and understanding the data, cleaning the data, building simpler models later. Issues for dimensionality reduction is how to represent objects, vector space, how do you normalize, these are issues. What is the criterion for carrying out this reduction process? So, when I am doing a dimensionality reduction, how do I reduce? So, first thing we have to do is the process of reducing the number of variables is what we are doing. So, you can do combination to reduce or you can do selection, we will come to that a little more in detail later. Then this dimensionally reduced data can be used for visualization, as we already saw. It can also help you to understand the data. It can be also used for cleaning the data or to build simpler modules. Some of the issues are how do I represent the data in vector space, how do I normalize the data, and what is the criteria that I should use for dimensionality reduction. So, what is the criteria for reduction? There are many criteria. It could be geometric based, it could be information theory based. There are many methods by which the criteria that is used. So, if you want to capture, now this is the essence of dimensionality reduction. Suppose you want to capture the variation in data, basically that is what you want to do. So, variations are signals or information in the data, that actually those variations are what is the essence of the data, that as we call it. So, you have, for doing that we have to normalize each variable first. So, the one of the essence of dimensional reduction is you want to capture the variance. The next is you want to discover variables of dimension highly correlated or dependent. So, you want to discover what are the correlations between the dimensions. So, represent highly related phenomena and combine them to form a simpler one. So, the two essences, one is I want to find the variation or look after the variation, in other words. The other one is I want to find correlation so that I can combine them. So, these are the two essence, two concepts of dimensionality reduction. So, if you look here, you have an example, this is from Georgia Tech. So, you have an example, you have class 0 is blue and class 1 is red, and you have two features and you try to draw the correlation between them. If you see, the data vary more in this direction and less in the other direction. So, we want to capture this, means you know you have to capture the variance. We will come to this again, this is just to show you what we mean by variance. So, now how can we reduce dimensionality? So, dimensionality can be reduced by two methods. One is feature reduction, that is all the original features are used, but you are combining the features either linearly or non-linearly, and you transform features are a combination of the original features. So, linearly or non-linear combined, but the transform features are a combination of the original features. So, some transformation to use all the features and get it into a lower dimension. The other one is do not use all the features, just use a subset of the original features. So, here the selection of the features is important. The first one, the combination is important, the second one is the selection is important. So, for example, you have this the large number of features, you can do selection, that is you just use the yellow ones or the red ones. The second one, you use all the features, combine them to form one feature and use all the combined features. So, again you are reducing the dimension. So, feature combination transformation or feature reduction, whatever it may be, the combination of high dimensional inputs to a smaller set of features, you train the classifier on the new features, do not use the old features, whatever method you are doing. Okay. For example, suppose I have x is equal to x1, x2, x3, x4, this is a 4 dimensional assuming. Now, you combine it x1 plus x2 and x3 plus x4 and you get a new y. Now, if you look here, we have not we are using all the features, original features, but we have combined it. This is a simple example. So, this is one method in which combination can be done. So, from a 4 dimensional you have reduced it to a 2 dimensional. Now, whether this is a correct reduction is another question. Ideally, the new vector y should retain all the information from x, all information that is important for classification, that is our issue. So, now what is our issue? I have x which is 4 dimensional, I am converting into y by just adding x1, x2 and x3, x4 like that and reducing it into 2. But when I do that, does the vector y retain all the information in x that is necessary for classification? That is what is the important aspect. So, that is feature combination. Now, feature selection, select a smaller subset of inputs or features from a large subset of inputs, train the classifier on the reduced input set, do not use the complete input set. So, one method of doing this selection is rank all the features based on interestingness measure, that interestingness has to be defined. and select and use the X percentage of features with top ranking based on the document frequency of TF-IDF or something like that. So, rank it and then use some percentage of it depending upon some parameter. So, term frequency variance, rank a term based on its variance of term frequency, higher variance means better terms. So, what it means is, this I can explain to you better. What it means is that I am having a term, let us assume document, you rank a term based on its variance with other terms. So, how different is it from other terms, and based on that you give it higher ranking, which means that the variance has to be captured. So, those are the better terms. So, now what is feature reduction? Feature reduction refers to the mapping of the original high dimensional data into a low dimensional space. So, criterion for feature reduction can be different based on different problem settings. So, in unsupervised setting you can minimize the information loss. So, combine it in such a way that you minimize the information loss. In supervised setting, maximize the class discrimination. So, given a set of data point of p variables, so x1, x2 to xp, compute the linear transformation, which is a projection, and that projection should be retain the features of the original set of high dimensional features. So, you are converting from a p dimension to a d dimension where d is less than p. Now, for example, this is the original data. So, that is you have the original data and you are converting, it is a d into p data, and you are converting from x to y in such a way there is a transformation g to the power of t, and you are into x, and you are converting into reduced data which is in the r to the power of d. So, this is a typical feature reduction problem. Original data, you can see the dimension r to the power of p, you are converting into an r to the power of d. So, that is the reduced data. How do you get this linear transformation? That is the fun. So, that part we will look at when the different techniques tell you how to do this, how to find this. There are mathematical techniques available. So, before we go further, let us talk about the application of feature reduction. It is used for face recognition, it is used for handwritten digit recognition, those two are image processing problems. It is used for text mining, text image retrieval, it is used again image process, microarray data analysis it is used for protein classification. So, many problems, typically classification type of problems, this type of feature reduction is used. So, from a high dimensional you are converting into low dimensional. There are two methods in which you do this. One is take the original all the original features, transform it into a lower dimension using some transformation, or from the original set only select some features. So, those are the two methods that we use. So, combine all features x to create new features y. So, that is what we said here, and when you that k, that dimension of that should be much less, take a function of the original d dimension and convert it such that you get only k dimension where k is less than d. So, the best f of x is most likely a nonlinear function. Assuming f of x is a linear mapping, it can be represented by a matrix W. So, now you have x1 to xd, that is the original dimension, w x1 to xd, that is w is a matrix. So, you have a matrix w1 d into d matrix and a d, so that you get a y1 to yk, where I mean you have a kd matrix and you have k less than d. So, that you have to find out the weight that you have to put to get this. So, three approaches for finding the optimal transformations are possible. One is principal component analysis. This seeks a projection that preserves as much information in the data as possible in a least square sense. Least square is error, you remember error, we spoke about this least square error. So, using that concept it tries to preserve as much information as possible. Next method that we will be looking at is Fisher linear discriminant. Find projection to a line such that the sample from different classes are well separated. Okay. So, here it is a projection that tries to discriminate, okay, and single value decomposition, transforming correlated variables into a set of uncorrelated ones. Now, in the three methods that we look at here, there are other methods possible. Principal component analysis uses information, that is it tries to reduce the information loss. Second one is Fisher linear, it tries to preserve the discrimination, okay, and they are well separated. And the third one, it tries to act upon the correlation. So, correlated values need not be, you can reduce it. So, that is trying to get a set of uncorrelated ones. So, in this module we will be talking about the first method, principal component analysis, and the next module we will be talking about Fisher linear discriminant and single value decomposition. So, let us look at principal component analysis. Main idea is seek most accurate data representation in a lower dimensional space. So, example in 2D, project data to 1D space align which minimize the projection error. So, for example, you have a large dimension 1. So, the dimension 2 is there. I want to put it project it onto a line. So, if I use the red line shown on the left hand side, you have large projection errors. You can see the error because that is the, when you project it there, that is the error that you see. So, you have to take a least mean and squared error. So, you find that here you have large projection errors, but if you choose the green line on the right hand side, you have small projection errors. So, this is a good line to project to. So, you can see the errors are the dotted lines for each and every point. If you take an average, you will see that the left hand side has much more error than the right hand side. So, the green line is a good projection line. So, from projecting to 2D to 1D. So, this just visualizes for you what we mean by this projection. So, what a principal component analysis? Idea is to reduce the dimension of a data set by finding a new set of variables smaller than the original set of variables. Retains most of the sample's information. Our job is not to take away the information, but useful for compression and classification of data. And by information we mean the variation present in the sample. So, here what we mean by information is the variation. So, we are trying to preserve the variation given by the correlation between the original variables. The new variables called principal components are uncorrelated and are ordered by the fraction of the total information each retains. So, the new variables that we are getting, which is transformed from the original space, are uncorrelated. Okay? So, that is what we mean by principal component analysis. Now, notice that the good line to use for projection lies in the direction of the largest variance. So, if you take a line in the largest variance, that will give you the good line for projection. After the data is projected to the best line, you need to transform the coordinate system to get the 1D dimension. For the example we used, 1D dimension for the vector y. So, you have to get the line and then project it. So, for example, this is it. Then after you get the line which we took from the 2D example, you have to project it to get y, and that is what you get here. So, note that the new y has the same variance as the old data x in the direction of the green line. So, this is what we are trying to say as principal component analysis. So, this projects the data along the direction where the data varies the most, that is what we said. These directions are determined. Now, how do we do this mathematically? This is determined by the eigenvectors of the covariance matrix corresponding to the largest eigenvalues. So, here we come across the linear algebra that we were talking about in the original modules. So, here we need to find the covariance matrix and the eigenvectors of the covariance matrix corresponding to the largest eigenvalues. So, the magnitude of the eigenvalues corresponds to the variance. So, the eigenvalues give you the variance along the eigenvector directions. So, assume there are D observables, that D observables are linear combination of k less than D vectors. We would like to work with the basis as it has lesser dimension and have almost all the required information, that is that. So, what we expect from such basis is uncorrelated or otherwise can be reduced further, have large variance or otherwise bear no information, that is the larger variance. So, for example, here principal component direction 1, principal component direction 1 and 2, and you have feature 1 and 2. So, choose the direction as data variation is high in this direction. So, where the data variation is high, choose that dimension. If you look here, the variation is less, and if you choose in the principal component direction 2, the variation is less. In the principal variation component direction 1, the variation is larger. So, choose that dimension as the projection dimension. So, choose direction such that the total variance of data will be maximum, that is maximize the total variance. Choose direction that are orthogonal, minimize the correlation. So, choose case less than the orthogonal direction which maximize the total variance. So, both the points we want to maximize the total variance and minimize the correlation. So, so the dimensional reduction implies information loss. PCA preserves as much information as possible, and that is why it is necessary to minimize the error. So, this is the original and projected. Should we determine the best lower dimensional space? The best lower dimensional space can be determined by the best eigenvectors of the covariance matrix of the data, that is the eigenvectors corresponding to the largest eigenvalues, which we call as principal components. So, that is what we have discussed this before also, just to re-emphasize this. Now, when we consider a d-dimensional space, we can calculate d by d symmetric covariance matrix estimated from the samples and select the k largest eigenvalue of the covariance matrix and the associated k eigenvectors. So, this is what we have to do. The first eigenvector will be a direction with the largest variance. So, you calculate the k ones and then try to find the one with the largest variance. So, let us look at the steps. So, let us assume that d is equal to x1 to xn. Each xi is a d-dimensional vector. We want to reduce the dimension to k, that is our job. So, the steps are, you find a sample mean in each of the dimensions and then subtract the mean from the data and compute the scatter matrix, okay, and then compute the eigenvectors E1, E2 to Ek corresponding to the k largest eigenvalues of the scatter matrix, and then E1, E2 to Ek be the columns of the matrix. Desired, so that is the scatter matrix. The desired y, which is the closest approximation of x, will be y is equal to e to the power of transform columns of that eigenvectors into z. So, this is the how you, these are the steps, the mathematical steps for computing the principal component. So, find the sample mean, subtract the mean from the data, compute the scatter matrix, this is available in MATLAB, compute eigenvectors E1 to Ek corresponding to the k, this is where we reduce k largest eigenvalues of S, and then make this into a column matrix and you get y, because so you have found the k largest and you find the y which is an approximation of x. So, that is this. So, the largest the eigenvalue of S, the largest the variance in the direction of the corresponding eigenvector, and so that is what. So, suppose you have 0.8 here and 30 there, the 30 is the one with the largest variance. The result is exactly what we expected. Project x into a subspace of dimension k which has the largest variance. So, this is very intuitive. You restrict attention to directions where the scatter is the greatest or variance is the greatest. So, thus PCA can be thought of as finding a new orthogonal basis by rotating the old axis until the direction of a maximum variance are found. So, that is what you are doing here. And the practical use is useful for pre-processing before classification. It does not take different classes into account, it only considers the properties of the different features. We are not bothered about the classes here. If two features xi and xj are redundant, then one eigenvalue in A is very small and one dimension can be dropped. So, we do not need to choose between two correlating features, it is better to do the linear transformation and then drop the least significant dimension. So, we are not choosing the features, we are doing the processing and then eliminating the or dropping the least significant. Both the correlating features will be utilized. So, drawback is PCA was designed for accurate data representation and not for classification. So, when you are, it preserves as much variance as of the data as possible. If direction of maximum variance is important for classification, it happens to be important for classification, it will work, but if it is not, it will not work. Okay. So, the direction of maximum variance may not be sometimes useful for classification. In that case, the principal component analysis will not work. Okay. So, we have explained the curse of dimensionality, we have discussed the concept of dimensionality reduction, and then we looked at the concepts of feature selection and feature reduction. Actually, the method we just looked at is feature reduction, and explain in detail the principal component analysis method of dimensionality reduction. Now, we will continue in the next module on two other methods of dimensional reduction. Okay. Thank you.